Hello everyone, in Shavua Tov. We ended last week by explaining the rationale behind the 7 o'clock p.m. all summer long Mincha Maariv on a Friday night. And the question I want to deal with now is a question that many have asked me, and that is that mean that you can daven both Mincha and Maariv after the Plag but before sunset, namely to take the kulas of the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehudah, or no, you have to still be makpid on the Plag. So we said last week that there is ample reason to daven Friday night early, be it because we want to have a means to do Tosefet Shabbat, to detract from Friday and add on to it the sanctity of Shabbos. What better way of doing that than doing an early Shabbos? Or, as the Magen Avraham said, since the Evarim and the Pedarin were not burnt from the Friday sacrifices Friday night, therefore there was no such thing as a Maariv at night on a Friday night, because since we patterned the Maariv based on the burning of those Evarim and Pedarin, and since they were burnt on Friday before Shabbos, namely before sunset, we should try to have an early Shabbos every week, maybe even in the winter. Based on those two reasons, obviously, you don't necessarily have to go ahead and negate the regular rules of Plag Mincha, or if I could say it differently, if indeed for the rest of the week you have to decide either you're a Rabbi Yehudah or a Chachaim, when it comes to Friday night, you could be more mekel and maybe take Rabbi Yehudah's opinion. But that's the limit of it. And that's basically what the Magen Avraham says. The Magen Avraham, who said that there's a real good reason to daven early Friday night because the parts of the animals were not burned Friday night, says not at all costs. He says, and I quote his words, he says in the name of a book called Mem Kuf, who I don't know who it is, that tzarich lizaher be'erev Shabbat litpalel mincha kodem Plag Mincha. Indeed, you have to be careful to make sure to daven mincha before the Plag and Maariv after the Plag. And the Mishnah Berurah echoes his words. The Mishnah Berurah comes along and says that yizaher al kol panim be'erev Shabbat litpalel mincha kodem Plag Mincha kedei shelo yeh tartei desatre aha dadei. Indeed, the Magen Avraham, who I quoted earlier, brings the Mordechai, who says that in general, Rashai la'asot pamkein upamkein. V'after kol kaima lanachi mikol makom be'erev Shabbat yesh lismoch alav. That sometimes you can do like this, and sometimes you can do like that. And even though we usually say, no, it's for your whole life, when it comes to the Eve of Shabbos, you should be mekel like the Mordechai. But not at all costs. So from this perspective, if indeed it's a good idea to have an early Shabbos, be it because of Tosefet Shabbos, be it because the parts of the animals were not burned Friday night, it's not at all costs, says the Magen Avraham and the Mishnah Berurah. You have to follow the regular rules and regulations of Plag. In other words, the whole dispensation of Friday night ends with, you can take Rabbi Yehudah's opinion once a week, and not the whole week. Indeed, that's opinion number one. But as you recall, we also brought another rationale for having an early Friday night, and that is of the Kesef Mishneh, who eventually wrote the Code of Jewish Law, of Yosef Karo. He says, based on the Rambam, that the Rambam explained you can daven early, lefi shetfilat arvit reshut en medagdekim bizmana, because Maariv is more optional than Shachris and Mincha. We don't have to be so pedantic about its time. And based on that, the Kesef Mishneh said that it's not just Friday night, but huadin b'chol yom, any day. You can be very, very lenient when it comes to Maariv. Based on that, it's not surprising that we have an opinion of the Bahag, long before the Kesef Mishneh, the Baal Halachot Gedolot, that brings the opinion of Rav that we quoted, that used to daven Maariv early on Shabbos, and he says, Shma Mina, namely, don't think when you read the Gemara that Rav was very pedantic to daven mincha before the Plag and Maariv after the Plag, but rather he davened at a 7 o'clock p.m. minyan. Namely, he davened mincha in accordance with Chachaim, Maariv in accordance with Rabbi Yehudah, and that's what the Gemara means, that he davened shel Shabbat, be'erev Shabbat. So based on that, obviously, you can daven at a 7 o'clock p.m. minyan and not worry so much about the Plag. The middle opinion is the Mishnah Bura. He brings an opinion that says, V'yeshomrim, the B'tzibor yesh lakel yitpalel Maariv min ba'od yom, av mitpalel mincha achar Plag mincha. In other words, the 7 o'clock p.m. idea is very good for a minyan. But if you're davening at home, be makbid on davening mincha before the Plag and Maariv after the Plag. But in a minyan, you can take the Chachaim for mincha and Rabbi Yehudah for Maariv. However, I should say that he does not personally like this opinion. Namely, he says that nirali she'en lismoch, you shouldn't rely on this. And therefore, in the Biur Halacha, he explains that ultimately he looked at all the Achronim and he couldn't find anyone that was Mekel in a minyan versus alone. And therefore, he says that basically, since there's no real source for it, you shouldn't be Mekel. So, to sum up, I think that a shul, if they have the ability, should definitely try to make their minyanim based on Plag mincha. But if it's difficult, there is ample room based on none other than the Kesef Mishneh, which seems to be the pshat in the Gemara, that Friday night is indeed different than the rest of the week. And even if you daven mincha in accordance with Chachamim, past the time of Rabbi Yehudah, and then you daven Maariv in accordance with Rabbi Yehudah, earlier than the time of the Chachamim, based on the Kesef Mishnah's understanding of the Rambam, there is ample room to be Mekel.